Hi, everyone. Welcome to Shaping Stronger Messages. Thank you for attending this session. And please feel free to drop all your comments, your questions in the chat, as well as there will be various sections for you to ask questions as well. So I'm kind of curious, how did you guys decide to join me today? I a few options, right? Like you heard a lot about database, would like to learn more generally. You want to improve your Excel skills, or you want to work on this in your internship or job. I hope that these little tricks would be helpful for you in all these topics in general. So let's look at some of the things we'll cover today, right? First, we look at the psychology of things. How do we decide what what messages to shape and so that they appeal the most to various people? Storytelling, because that's a main topic. How do we then shape our message, knowing the psychological tricks? Of course, further quick tricks and a chance to practice. First, let's look at psychology. And the formal term for this would be pre-attentive attributes. A quick quiz. How many fives would you guess there are in this little table? I'll give you a bit of time to have a look. Now, if I show you this, do you think it would be easier for you to count the number of fives? I think it would be for most people. And this is a very easy example of pre-attentive attributes. Basically, that just a little change by highlighting the things that we are looking for, it helps us to draw eyes to something. So let's look at pre-attentive attributes themselves. These are just some examples, non-exhaustive. But basically what these are is things that make it so that we don't have to put in conscious effort, but our eyes are immediately drawn to them. So for example, in the first case, we see that there's a shape that's different, or a color that's different, or a box highlighting the three squares that we want to focus attention on. A difference in length, a difference in size, and a difference in position. Now, keep all these in mind because when you go then to create a data viz, these are little ways you can use to focus attention on the area to strengthen your story. Next, let's look at how exactly we read charts. When I show you this chart from The Economist, where do you think you start reading it? So it's something that I'm sure most of us are not very conscious about. But for me, I would first have my eyes focus unconsciously on the areas where I see the most bubbles, the most concentrated areas. I might then go down to the legend, the title, the axis, and last, the extra footnotes. Now, why is this important? It's because if you put a bit more attention every time you see a new chart, you realize that we don't read a chart sequentially. It's not a left to right reading. So this means that when you create a chart, then you want to make use of all these psychological biases to then draw your audience's attention via contextual clues. So let's apply this to an actual example. We're looking at sales trends across 2 years. Can anyone tell me what might be the problem or the weakness in this chart? Okay, so if we look at this one, which is actually very similar to the previous, right? You'll notice that this one looks a lot more professional. What are the little tricks that we have used to improve this chart so much more? So for me, it's firstly aligning the text to the left because it makes it look neater in general. We have a subtitle, in this case saying there's an increasing trend in H2 2022, which is perhaps our key story in this case. So you're making it easier for your audience by telling them, this is the takeaway. Please notice it. We also use colors to link concepts. So if you remember the previous chart, it was a blue line and an orange line. But in this case, the lines are actually relating to different years. So you can use a similar color, a darker and lighter blue, to help your audience realize, hey, it's both, we're both talking about years, to then link that concept for them in their minds. And we also want to remove legends when possible. If you can remember, we actually had a legend somewhere in the middle of the chart just now. But in this case, we've just put the legends labels directly to the side of the lines, which makes it a lot easier because your audience doesn't have to put in extra effort to draw their eyes from the line to the legend. So very simple tricks, but I think these tricks work every time. So something to keep in mind. Now, that brings us to the end of our first section. Does anyone have any questions so far before we go into storytelling? If not, let's go into the meat of our section, right? So, what is storytelling and why is it important? Because beyond just creating a chart, which is a very, very important skill, to drive value add in our work, we want to drive action. Basically, through a chart, tell people this is what you should do after seeing this amazing chart. So, what can we do? For me, a good data viz, non-exhaustive again, but you should think of three main things: your audience, your message, as well as action. So, firstly, think about your audience. When I'm creating a chart for my really, really big boss, he is obviously someone with not a lot of time. If you look at the calendar of your bosses, they might have an hour, half an hour break in the whole of their day. This means that when you're presenting a chart to them, you want to make sure that they get the key message as soon as possible. So, therefore, a very high level guidance is that a chart should take 20 seconds, perhaps even 2 seconds for a high level manager. But when it comes to an analyst, someone whose job it is to analyze data and who might want to explore the data a bit more, then you might want to give them a bit more details so that they have time to dive into the data because that's part of their work. At the same time, you also want to know what your audience needs. And there are two main types of data visualizations. The first is exploratory, and the second, declarative. What is exploratory? It's basically data viz for the purpose of generating questions. And that's why function is more important than form. So, for example, when it comes to having a dashboard, you want to create a dashboard which allows for you to your audience to explore the data that they need need to explore in their work. At the same time, function over form could mean that you don't want to spend too much time creating this data because what you want to do is looking at, for example, our previous slide, right? Sales across 2 years. What the main story from that chart was, oh, H2, the second half of the year, is more important. So you don't need to spend a lot of time creating that chart, but just having the first rough draft of the chart, it already tells you, hey, maybe I should focus on H2. Or hey, I want to look at why H1 had such weak sales. So creating graph charts, charts that take you very little time, don't need to be perfect, but help you to dive deeper into your analysis. The second type is, of course, declarative. Basically, for example, the type of charts we want to present to a C-suite manager, which is focused on your key ideas, focused on the key trends, and telling them this is what you should take away from the chart. Now let's look at message, right? Here's a chart from actually one of this very cool practice called Makeover Mondays. Feel free to Google it. And can you tell me what the key story is here? And how would you highlight the story in this case? It isn't a messy chart, but it's not also a very good chart for me. Okay, I see that everyone here is a bit shy. Um, Here's my attempt to recreate the chart using highlighting the key story. You can see that it's fairly different between this and this. I've cut out one entire section. So instead of 4 lines, right, you only see 2 lines here. For me, the key message behind this chart is that if we look at this, good and bad are actually a percentage of respondents. We don't need to see both of them. But what we need to see, right, and for me, the key message is that across the years, German respondents have thought that relationship with the US is not good and potentially worsening. But for the US, it's maybe even on a slight increasing trend and generally very good. So that's a key message I wanted to highlight. And in that case, I can eliminate the 2 lines of bad because that doesn't help my message at all. Conversely, something like this would give you a better idea. Something else I did was that you can see I put in the title German uh, in orange and the line here in orange. So you could also add Germany to the right of the chart, but using your title as a way of a legend is also a good option. Now, the last section, right? Action. So after looking at your chart, what should your audience do? And you want to make sure that you're supporting data-driven decisions, and that can be done through having a subtitle, like we had in the previous slide, which says, "Oh, marketing is more effective in Q1." So that highlights a key takeaway that managers can have from this data biz, which is that, should we do more marketing in Q1, or should we re-examine our marketing campaigns in Q2, Q3, and Q4 to understand why they're not so effective? At the same time, you also want to perhaps drive better conversations. So it could be that it's too early to draw conclusions, but you need to monitor a certain situation closely. So make sure that when you create your chart, when you think about your key story, you also think about what actions you want to drive based on that chart. Before we go into our next section, any questions? If not, let's go into the best practices. So you need to choose your data viz well, obviously, but what does that actually mean? In the first, we look at simplify. So if you look at this, right, it's a chart I created very quickly in Tableau, but you can see that's very messy. Like, I don't know what the key story is. I tried to highlight it with the title, but it's still not the easiest to have a key takeaway. So if in contrast, if you just look at this, where I only highlighted a certain region like Africa, you can, by highlighting that data point, you can focus people more on the African story. And that's what I meant with the subpoints here. When you look at a very complicated chart, your first draft of a chart, think of what elements you can remove. If your main story is about Africa, it's perhaps not so important to highlight all the other colors, or you can put them there, but in a more faded sort of way. And this is something that's fairly easy to create in Tableau. You want to highlight your key data points, and also remember that the human eye, the human mind, can't really take a lot of different data. When I look at this here, it's not a lot of colors. I have 6 different groups, but still it looks like an overload of data. So something to keep in mind when you try to come up with a very solid chart. The other thing you can do, right, is to try to group your trends. So what I tried to do here is I grouped the data by regions in terms of Africa, Americas, Asia. If I hadn't grouped this, it's still possible, but it makes it harder to find the key message. By contrast, I could say that in terms of this topic, maybe it's a practice that's more prevalent in Africa and some parts of Asia. So by grouping, you are able to highlight some trends better. Next, we look at eliminating something you mentioned just now. So and this is again the key trends with the US, right? What can be improved here? You don't want to show elements that don't help your story. Like I said just now, it's all a proportion. So I could just present maybe just a line showing the bad or a line showing the good, but I don't have to present all of it. Or even though there is a section of no ideas, it's a fairly small portion. So I can put it in a footnote, but it might not be something very important to keep in your chart. So think of what you could remove from your chart. Another thing that I kind of removed in this case was the axis. So it's something that you can choose. You can either choose to have an axis so people can estimate the values in the chart, or in this case, I chose to label them if I wanted people to know the precise points of each chart. Usually, you don't need to have both the axis as well as the data point labels. Another section would be comparing data. So when you put data side by side, again, something that can be fairly easily done on Tableau, it allows for easier comparison. In this case, I'm looking at data in 2010 and 2020. And what I wanted to do is understanding if there's an aging population. So based by being able to see the charts on top of each other, I can see that in 2010, the peak of the most common segment was actually the 30 to 34 group. But in 10 years, it's actually shifted quite significantly to 40 to 44. And you can see that most of the age groups have shifted to the right as well. So might not be the best way to present it, but by putting it side by side, I can see that there is significant aging, which is highlighting the story I want to tell. Now, we also want to make sure that we don't mislead people. What are possibilities of how we mislead people? If I look at this graph of vaccinations across different age groups, it seems like there is a not so great a difference, or actually a greater difference between the younger group as well as the older group. Now, if I show you this, you can see that the difference is actually a lot more minor. What is the difference in these two charts? The difference is that in the first case, I have started my axis at 40. And by manipulating the gaps between the charts, I can make it seem like there is a bigger difference between the groups when in reality, if I started at 0, there wasn't such a big difference. So one thing you can do is make sure you start your axis at 0 unless it's very necessary to do otherwise. And if you don't start it at 0, know that you can mislead your audience. The other very common thing about misleading, right, is avoiding a dual axis. In this case, I'm looking at vaccinations, so the blue bars, as well as number of mentions on Instagram. Is there a link between the two? Logically, maybe not. Maybe we're not sure. But by putting the two charts together, and you can see that it's two different things, right? Percentage and amount, I can make people feel like there is a mental link between the two topics. So be very careful when you do this as well, because it can mislead your audience. The key question you want to ask yourself here is, by choosing what I do my data visualization, am I making my message clearer, or am I actively manipulating and changing the message? Okay, so the next point, let's do a bit of practice, right? How can you practice so that you get better with data visualizations? Firstly, practice means creating lots of data viz so that you can be fast at doing it and knowing what works better. So one thing would be you want to prep, talk, sketch, and finalize. When it's prep, so let's say your boss gives you a task. Can you please create a database of Google Trends when it comes to COVID? What interesting messages can we come up with from there? So when that task is given, what you need to ask yourself is, okay, where can I find this data? How can you need to clean the data because it might be that there's a lot of unnecessary information in the data. You want to know, who am I presenting it to? What's the best way to present this data to them? And then you want to talk to people. So let's say if you want to present this data to teams in Singapore, could you talk to any teams that you know in Singapore to get their opinions? You want to talk to your boss to understand better the task he gives you. So in this, we look at talking to your audience that you're creating data for, talking to an outsider, because as you create a data, you become so in love with something you're creating that you might be stuck in that box. And you need someone who's a total outsider to tell you, hey, what you're thinking is not actually what I'm seeing. You might also want to talk to an expert, for example, in this case, COVID vaccine research scientists, who can give you more insights to add to your database to make it even more helpful. Then, based on all your preparation, the talking, you can sketch and generate options. And lastly, you can finalize to say, out of all the many options that I created, maybe this is the best database and improve it. So it's an iterative process. After you finalize, you can go back to talk to people and keep improving it until it's a good database. One thing to think about here is we talked about audience and purpose, right, before. So if it's something that your boss needs to do for exploratory database, you might not want to spend a lot of time doing these steps. But if it's something that you want to present to your CEO, you probably want to spend a lot of time making sure that it's a very neat, very professional database. Now, a bit of practice. Let's try to answer this if you can. Firstly, what do you think you see from this database? Try not to think too much, just give me your first impressions. What do you like or dislike from this database? What are three things you would change? And how would you schedule an improved version? These are things that you can ask yourself, you can practice with whenever you see a database, and that will make you stronger in presenting data as well. Since I know this audience is slightly shy, I will give you the answers. Feel free to go back and reflect on it after this as well. But for me, one of the weaknesses that I see, right, is I see here that there's 1 to 9 times, there's 10 to 29 times. I don't really know what that means. So it means that the axis, the legends, aren't very, very helpful. The title, what do you mean by the numbers? And then you have a subtitle, which is very, very long. So the title is also not the most helpful here. And what I like is I do like that it's split across different substances. So that's interesting. I get more information. But what I dislike is the long subtitle, of course, to understand the context. And you can see that when you talked about, starting from zero, having the same kind of axis, they actually made the error here, because you see that 0% in for opiates is actually around the same proportion as alcohol at 21%. So obviously the proportions are fairly off here, and that doesn't help your audience come to the right conclusions. It's misleading. So generally, based on those feedback, how I would change is I might include more legends on the bars. That this is actual versus perceived usage based on the white and orange. I might standardize the y-axis so that it's a fair measurement across all three substances. And if we want to explore, right, because we talk about sketching our own versions, I might look at, is there a need for a bar chart? Is the bar chart the best way to present this data? We might want to, we talked about eliminating. So is it important to present every single thing, or can we show our story better by removing certain data sets? So things to think about in this case. Next, for some of you who are budding data visualization people, or business intelligence people, a good thing to check out is always research on what is most popular. So this is from the Gartner's Magical Quarter, which shows which are the more popular software for database. In this case, I think Tableau wins by far. Microsoft is, what is it called? Microsoft BI, I think, which is another very popular software. For people who want to dive deeper into it, you can also use like DS3. You can use R or Python, for example. I also gave you a very quick view. I'm not sure this is the most up-to-date. Feel free to dive into it if you're interested. But you can see the difference between Power BI, Tableau, and Qlik, which are some of the more popular database softwares out there. So that's the end of my presentation. Feel free to ask questions, and I think I did see a few questions on the chat, which I'll try to answer. So I think the first one is, do fonts matter in visualizations? Yes, they can help to better emphasize your story. So let's say, number one, I think you've probably heard in school, right? Like, there's a reason why Times New Roman is the default font, because it's a font that's easier to read. So if you're concerned about readability, that could be something you want to choose. The other thing that fonts might matter, in Google, for example, we have a preferred Google font, actually. So if it comes to a official presentation, that's probably what we're going to use because it's company branding. If you're presenting a database on Valentine's Day, you might want to choose a font that gives more of a sense of romance. So in that sense, that's when font can help shape your story or align with corporate branding. Is there any best practice when choosing which chart or bar based on the data? I think at the end of the day, right, what I shared just now. So make sure that you want to sketch quite a lot. So this is the one. So like prep, talk, sketch, and then finalize. So you can look at that to decide on which chart to use. There's also fairly there. You can also Google it online. There are recommendations for, let's say, if you're doing a comparison. These are the recommended database. There's no perfect answer because it depends on every situation. I would say it's experience and it's looking at many databases. What are the skills someone should have? It depends on how deep you want to go into this topic. When we talk about data viz, we have people who are called business BI, business intelligence. So that would be focusing on dashboarding, where you have to be very familiar with Microsoft Power BI or for on Tableau. We also have people like me. I'm actually a finance analyst. So my database is to help my boss come to business decisions. You also have database experts like if you look at New York Times, The Economist, where they take really complex data and they condense it for someone to understand. So I think you need to understand which kind of career you want to go into. But I think knowing how to tell your story, like in the end, your database is only as good as the story and the takeaway that people get. So I think that is one option. Focusing on your story first, thinking and reflecting on what you want to tell before you choose and come up with the database. And an example is some of the database I created here were actually just done on Excel. So it's not about a complex software per se, but it's about how to shape your message more creatively and intelligently. How do I choose my color palette? Interesting question. There is a growing study which shows that because we have people who are colorblind, so to be more friendly and to respect diversity, you want to avoid colors that people who are colorblind blind might not be able to identify. There are a lot of websites you can just Google like online to tell you what colors you can choose as an alternative. Um, Similarly, you could like let's say in Tableau, there is a recommended like palette of colors that you can choose. Aside from that, I would say like I might associate colors with countries, with my data. So, for example, if I'm doing a country comparison, I might choose a color that is more linked mentally, psychologically with that country to create those extra mental links and strengthen my story. Suggested resources, it goes a bit into how you want to develop. I think there's this book I really liked a lot called Storytelling with Data. It's actually written by an ex-Googler, and that actually gives you a very good basis, a very good foundation of the database basics. So that could be a really good. Um, that's a really good thing to start with. I think another interesting one is called How to Lie with Statistics, which tells you of like traps that you might want to avoid. So there are a lot of really cool books that you can check out. Um, yeah, I would say like also maybe there's a cool newsletter called Flowing Data, which explores good database online as well. So try to look as many charts as possible and learn more. Um, so how do we communicate the messages more strongly, right? I think that goes to my first point, which of the psychology. So you want to know what uh, appeals to people. So like this, all of these are good practices. So think of these when you try to come up like pre-attentive attributes. Think of how we read charts. Think of like all these little things to keep your charts neater, and that can help in your overall storytelling. Um, Courses or tutorials? I think at the end of the day, I would need a bit more data to know what you're looking for. So if you're looking at more BI, like Tableau is really a very popular software. We do use it in Google as well. Tableau actually has a lot of video tutorials on their website, and they have a section where they showcase like the best Tableau charts of the week, of the day. So that's something that you can check out first. Okay, cool. I think we are at time. Thank you for attending the talk, and hopefully it was something that was helpful to you. And all the best for your database explorations.